So Amy's been with Extension. Gosh, Amy, I don't know what year you started. It's pretty close to when I started. Amy's a longtime educator up in Lucas County in the Toledo area with lots of hats. She does a lot of really good work with invasive species of all sorts. She worked with emerald ash borer, with Dutch elm disease, with some of our newer invasive pests. I just watched a webinar with Amy on Amy, it's the spotted lanternfly. And so some really good work organizing some larger projects across the state, as well as working there in the county with master gardener groups, horticulture programs, working with commercial and consumer horticulture. So Amy, thank you so much for, yes. Did somebody have a question or jump in? Amy, thanks so much. You can go ahead and share your screen. I'll turn the podium over to you.
Excellent. Can you see that?
Yes, I do.
All right. And coming through okay on my audio?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for the invite. I know this group is doing some powerful things with native plants and native ecosystems. And, sometimes I feel like I'm kind of the downer of the group and talking about the kind of the bad things. But hopefully you'll take some information away, and especially in things that you can share with others. And so we're all about spreading the word and increasing knowledge and the impacts that we can make. So let me just get to my screen here. There we go. So in this short period of time that I'm with you, I've got a couple session objectives, including why do we buy plants, kind of that background about native, non-native, and invasive, and kind of which distinguishes each of those. I'm going to talk about the impacts of our purchases or purchases that other gardeners make. We're going to talk about some invasives on the radar, maybe some old invasives that have been around a long time, and maybe some new ones that are that we're experiencing up close and personal. Just mention briefly about reporting invasive species, including the plants that we'll talk about today, and then end with some resources. So why do we buy plants? I know it's a fairly large group today, but if you want to put some comments in the chat box, and I'm going to have kind of pose this question at two different levels. And so you can respond to either one of those. So you personally, why do you buy plants? And then think of the general backyard gardener who maybe gardening isn't their passion, but why would somebody like that buy plants? And let me pull up my chat here so I can kind of see. I'm going to pull this over on the screen. Great. So color for your landscape, instant gratification, unusual, help wildlife, just pure enjoyment. Oh, I love great comments. Thank you so much. Minimize lawns. Yep. Definitely therapeutic, right? And so, when I started in college, learning about plants, both native and non-native, we often kind of are pulled toward that aesthetic side, the beauty of the plant. But I really tried to engage people at all levels, right? And some of those comments that you made in the chat box. So what's the power of that plant? What can that plant do for you besides just being pretty? And so what are those values associated with that? And I often think we still need to do a better job at that, because especially just the general gardener or that first-time gardener, they're drawn into the beautiful side, right? But what else can that plant do in your landscape? And of course, with my background in ornamental horticulture, it unfortunately didn't take long, and I was exposed to the invasive species side. And in this case, it was actually an insect. So not too long into my career in extension, we had a gypsy moth outbreak. And I say kind of the history, that's the start of the history with invasives and me. And I still like the beautiful side of horticulture. but unfortunately, I've been kind of woven into this invasive species side. So I always like to start when I talk about invasives, kind of with just some basic questions. And so the first, and if you want to type something in the chat, you're more than welcome to. If somebody says native, what does that mean? What comes to mind if somebody says native? Local, great. Yeah, something that's been there for a while, right? Native, here before European settlers. Great comment, Shannon. Yeah, so you can kind of, that evolution, right? Origin, not cultivated at any level. Great. Now I'm going to go to the next slide. Whoops. So non-native. And so maybe somebody's just going to put, hey, opposite of native, right? But are there other words that come to mind or thoughts that come to mind when somebody says non-native? Oh, Brandy says evil. Okay, so we'll keep that term evil for just a second, right? Because the other term I want to include is invasive. And what I want to make sure is, so we know the definition of native and non-native and those differences. But I think there's always a point of clarification that sometimes we can have something that's non-native, but isn't invasive. And so let's just illustrate that a little bit. All right, anybody know what this photo is? Yeah, so European honeybee, so not native, but surely not invasive. Sometimes a lot of the foods that we eat, right, are non-native, but not problematic, not invasive. Has anybody had a reaction to a plant like this? I see some nods. I see yes. Yeah, and so poison ivy. I mean, there's different plants that can cause different reactions, but poison ivy, a native plant, but some may say, yeah, that's a horrible plant, especially if they have reactions like that. So here's a question to get you thinking. Do invasive species increase or decrease biodiversity? And so just kind of think in your mind, increase, decrease. Overall, they decrease it. Decrease, yeah. So, if you typed in decrease, usually decrease, that's a good answer. If you typed in or thought increase, that's not a bad answer either, right? So when we have an invasive species come in, at first, it actually increases biodiversity, right? We have a new species. But unfortunately, if it's invasive, it often displaces other species. And so that's where we see the decrease in biodiversity. So if you had a thought or you put something in chat box, whether it was increase or decrease, you were absolutely right. And so when we talk about invasive species, and we're going to focus on plants today, it's an organism growing or living outside of its native or natural range, usually human introduced. And it's a species that spreads into areas, often into these native plant systems that we like to protect, we like to keep, right, how they are, to the detriment of those species. And so it displaces, it outcompetes. An invasive species cause harm. So that whether that's ecological harm, environmental harm, economical harm. So it's costing people dollars to manage that, or human harm. And so that's another important definition of invasive. So let's talk about impacts on our purchases. So when we buy a plant, and this is true with any plant, a native plant that we want. We think about how does it grow? Is it a perennial? Is it an annual? Is it a woody plant? How does it reproduce? What are the root systems like? And this would be the same as true with invasive species, right? Because that helps us identify how to manage or control those species. And so when we think about the impact that our own landscapes or our neighbors' landscapes have on the environment, we really need to take a step back. Yes, plants are important and they play an important role, but choosing plants that are better for the environment are really important. Now, in this case, there's a lot of native and non-native plants in this landscape. It's pretty much maintained. There were some, oh my goodness. I just lost my train of thought there.
Barberry.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Thanks, Kathleen. So in the previous picture, those barberries were pruned and maintained as like small hedges, right? And so in that case, that was kind of the saving grace because they weren't able to flower and set seed and reproduce. And so this situation is more problematic because, they are left to complete their life cycle. And so the birds come in, take those plants away, and then pop up. Now, I've had so many conversations with individuals that have plants that are invasive in their landscape. And when I say they're invasive, they look at me like I'm crazy because they say, well, they're not problematic in my own landscape. And really, that's where we need to have a broad view, right? And so not just in our own landscape, but how do those plants impact nature outside of our landscape? And this is a great thing to tell individuals, to share with individuals who maybe have some plants that are troublesome, that are invasive, that need to be addressed because it's the impact that it's having on other people's properties. So when we talk about invasive plants, I just grabbed a few just to kind of illustrate. The first one is kind of an old one. It's been around for a long time. Many of you might have participated in garlic mustard pulls or removals on some private properties or public properties. But garlic mustard can become a carpet to the detriment of anything else that might be growing in that area. And it's that rosette that starts the first year, that's that carpet that then pops up, flowers, and sets seed. And so you can tell it's truly in the mustard family by the flower and then the seed. And we can probably all hear if we've ever walked through an area with garlic mustard where those seeds are ripening and start to pop open and spread. I mean, it's just a horrible sound as you're walking or wildlife is moving through and you can hear those seeds just permeating other areas. When we talk about invasive species, there are a lot of ways to manage or control. And so often it's that toolbox approach that you're not just going to do one thing to get rid of it, but it's going to be a lot of effort, a lot of different tools over a period of time. I want to just mention a couple vines. Oriental bittersweet is one that I'm getting a lot of questions and receiving a lot of pictures. What is this? Especially this time of the year where a lot of the fruit have already fallen, but people are concerned about this vine that's wrapping around other plants in their landscape, in their woods, on side yards. It used to be called the kudzu of the north, but it's becoming really problematic. And know that there's a couple photos here of the Asian bittersweet to the left and the American bittersweet to the right. They are crossing and producing hybrids of the two. And so you may have a vine that has characteristics of both. And unfortunately, when they hybridize, often it takes the genetics of that aggressive growth along with it. The other vine that I want to mention, just to make sure that it's on our radar, we're seeing more and more of this, is kudzu. Often people thought this was a vine that was just in the South. It would never overwinter in Ohio, and unfortunately that is untrue. Here's a couple of photos that I borrowed from Kathy Smith in Sinclairsville, Ohio, and just this almost mountain, right, of kudzu, and the individual trying to figure out how to manage that situation. It was a plant, like most that are introduced for a positive purpose, and then unfortunately just kind of takes over a situation. And so it was widely planted for soil erosion, and that it does an amazing job mean, the soil does not move once kudzu moves in. It was also planted as part of CCC projects, but was removed in the mid 1950s as a permissible plant. And so unfortunately, that often happens. We take these plants that have certain benefits, we introduce them and don't realize how aggressive or invasive they are. So I call kudzu the like poison ivy on steroids, right? So we've got the compound leaf here, palmately compound, and it can just take over. These photos are from an area in Cleveland. It was kind of an industrial area that had been introduced, and that brick building in the background, we went inside, and actually there were places where the kudzu was growing through the building and inside. Ohio, we kind of thought early on that, our growing season is much shorter than down south. And so, maybe it will flower, but for sure it would never have enough time to set seeds. And unfortunately, that plant has changed its growing pattern and can produce seeds, viable seeds, within our growing season, even up north. Another plant that's getting a lot of attention is burning bush. This example wouldn't be as bad, right? Because they're making it into a hedge, so they're removing the potential seeds for the future on a regular basis. But it's the plants that are left to go natural that have high seed loads, and then the birds are drawn into the plant and then planted everywhere. And unfortunately, it's becoming problematic in a lot of our natural areas. The other plant, this one's a tree that I wanted to include in our discussion today, is tree of heaven, or ailanthus. This has a compound leaf that can be over 3 feet in size. But each of those leaflets, you'll see here, have these glands at the base of each leaflet. And so sometimes people can get confused with tree of heaven, especially younger plants, sometimes confused with sumac or black walnut. But if you can feel the base of each leaflet, you'll feel those glands for tree of heaven. Also know that there's females and males. And so here in the photo, I'm showing the female flower. And if you are in a situation where you have to manage, sometimes you need to prioritize. You can't do everything at once. And so managing those female trees that are problematic in their seeds can reduce populations. And so tree of heaven, or ailanthus, is a prolific seeder, 300,000 seeds a year. Now, not all of them will germinate, but you can see where it can become pretty problematic. They also will give off an allelopathy compound, like a lot of our invasive species will, to make sure that they have a better growth, right? So they're not competing at different levels. The other thing I wanted to mention, so my latest invasive species hat, like Denise said, is spotted lanternfly. Just to give a shout out, make sure that we're looking for that. Right now it's in the egg mass stage, and we won't see adults if they're here in Ohio, beyond the 2 infestations that we already know in Jefferson and Cuyahoga County, not until later in the summer. And so if you have opportunities for education and outreach, let me know, and would love to continue to get the word out about this new invasive here in Ohio. But back to plants. So this is a plant that we've been dealing with in the north for quite a while, called phragmites. And interesting enough, when I talked to Joe Boggs in Hamilton County, down by Cincinnati, this one is not as obvious or instilled into the landscape yet. And so this is an aquatic plant, so it likes those low areas. Often we see them along roadsides and ditches. And I'll tell you, the other day, well, I guess earlier in the 2021, I mean, it is stunning with those seed heads. You can see where people are attracted to it. But this particular day, there was actually somebody digging out some along the roadside. And I'm like, oh no, the worst thing you want to do is to bring that into your landscape because you're going to be fighting it for a long time. There is a guide to control and management of phragmites. And so that's a great resource, especially we're seeing a lot of homeowners associations having to deal with this in retention ponds. All right, so we talked a little bit about plants. We're doing pretty good on time. And now I just want to encourage you when you're outdoors, enjoying nature, right? The beautiful side, the good side of the environment. We do have an app that you can report invasive species, which includes the plants that we talked about today. And so many of you might be familiar. Hopefully some of you might have this app on your smartphone. This is the Great Lakes Early Detection Network, or GLEDN. And what's great about it is you can be out doing the things that you love, but if you stumble upon something that's invasive and could report that for us, we really appreciate it. It's a great educational tool as well. And so you can choose categories that you're interested in. You can actually make your own species list. So if you get into the app and think, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming, there's so much here, I really just want to focus my efforts on these 5 plant species. You can make your own list and really focus in that way. But if you're really want that broad approach, you can see here fish, insects, mammals. We also have the other or the unknown. So if you see Sasquatch, that one we're not sure who has to verify that, but I stick with the insects typically. But you can choose categories. So we're going to kind of walk through just real quickly about trees. And so if you pick that tree category, you'll scroll through a list of all the trees. And this is a multi-state list. So there are plants on the list that maybe another state says this is really problematic. Maybe we haven't seen that here in Ohio, but I think that's great that it's on the list because that's our kind of our lookout list, or ones that we need to be concerned about. You can choose images just to make sure that that's what you're seeing. There's additional information, so appearance, foliage, flowers, descriptions. And then you'll see that you'll want to take a picture, and I apologize, we're switching from Ailanthus to Oriental Bittersweet just for this photo here. But you identify where you're at, you take a photo, and then you can describe the area. So maybe it's just a single plant that you want to report, or you can draw a polygon if it's a large area. And this was the case with Oriental Bittersweet. We had one of our service foresters for the Ohio Division of Forestry saw some Oriental Bittersweet out in a woodlot in southern Ohio. At first glance, he thought, oh gosh, it's a few acres. He went back out, walked the woods in different areas, and his estimate was over 500 acres of Oriental Bittersweet. And so for that woodland owner, management options are limited when it gets to be that large and that out of control. Some of the states actually will track their time. And so you can see here, time spent in minutes if you want, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You're going to hit save, and then it's going to go to an upload in the queue, which is kind of really important because often when we're out in the field, maybe we don't have the best cell phone reception. And so when it's uploading those to the website, it's taking a lot of data, a lot of time. And so what we've added to this to the app is that they all go up to this upload in the queue, and then when you get back to a reliable Wi-Fi or your home, you just go back into it, say upload to the queue, and then they all get sent at once. And then once they're verified through those photos, through additional conversations, it becomes a red dot. And so we're hoping this is going to be a way that individuals like yourself can get on the maps and take a look and see where these reports are. So how close is kudzu to you if you haven't seen it in your area? I'm just going to finish up with the next couple minutes on some resources. And so I'll tell you, when I was watching Denise earlier, those excellent resources that you have available to your fingertips. I can provide these too with links, Denise, if you'd like afterwards, so you don't have to, write down a lot of things that I'm showing. But these are some of my favorites. So we've got the Ohio Invasive Plants Council, great resource. They are running plants through an assessment to determine if what their invasiveness, is or not. And so this is just a continuous process. They have a publication that you might be interested in. It's Alternatives for Invasive Plants in Ohio. And so often, when you have that conversation with your friend, I actually just had a conversation last week with a homeowner who loved burning bush, and she had a new property, and that's what she wanted to line the one side. And I was like, oh, you really don't want to do that. And we had that invasive conversation. And of course, her next question is, well, then what should I plant? And so this is a great resource to kind of go into that conversation. Additionally, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and they have partnered with the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative. They actually have an app on your phone that has this information. So it's much broader than just Ohio, but you can put in the invasive and it'll come up with a list of other alternatives and information about those plants. And they also have it in a brochure format if you need a paper copy. I want to mention the Ohio Department of Agriculture. So they are the regulatory authority in Ohio and have always had regulatory authority on invasive insects, diseases, and then noxious weeds. But recently they are also doing invasive plants. And so they've come up with this invasive plant list. And so it's a plant advisory committee that comes up and reviews these plants. And you'll see that it'll restrict the sale and planting of invasive plants here in Ohio. And so they had this list of, I think it was 38 plants that went into effect immediately, but there were 2 of them, the European wand loosestrife, that started in January 2019. And then next January, so a year from today, it will be illegal to sell or plant calorie pear, so Pyrus caloriana, here in Ohio. And some people say, well, why did it take that long? And we can have a discussion about that, but know that they will be outlawed next January. And we all know the story likely of the calorie pear, and it's popping up everywhere. But this spring, just if you're not familiar with that, just take notice, because those white, beautiful flowers that we think, oh, nature, but how invasive and problematic a plant like that can be. And know that some of those plants are reverting and have thorns. And so it can be kind of dangerous once you get into those areas. You just have to be really careful with eye protection. And then another website that I love is invasive.org. I joke with my family that whenever we go on vacation, I like to take a look at this website to see where we're going and what invasives are kind of hot in that area, and be able to take photos or see what that area is dealing with. And then a publication that you can download as a PDF through the Forest Health Assessment through USDA is New Invaders of the Northeast and North Central, focusing primarily on plants. And then, of course, we've got some quick fact sheets here. And again, I will send all of those to you along with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. So that's the presentation, Denise. Sorry, I went about a minute over, but I would love to get some questions.
Great, Amy, thanks so much. And thanks for sharing all those great resources. I really appreciate that. So folks, what we're gonna do is have a few minutes on questions, and then we're gonna do a breakout group so we can talk about some of our invasive issues and then come back with Amy. So Amy, I'll let you handle those questions. There are a couple coming into the chat box.
Sure. So could bittersweet be harvested? I'll try to keep up as more questions are getting in there. So absolutely. Let me stop sharing so I can see all your faces. So you can harvest bittersweet, right? People may think, well, that's a way I can get it out of nature. Just want to make sure, though, that you're not putting it as wreaths on doors or in outdoor locations that the birds can still have access to it. So ultimately, we want to manage and control that rather than having it available that people want to continue to harvest it. So yes, reducing the seed out in nature might be helpful, but that's always kind of a double-edged sword because we don't want more of it out there that people actually want to use for decorations. Let's see. Sorry, let me grab that. My chat box just collapsed on me here.
Amy, I did put the link in there for the app and also for the new and what was it called? New Invaders of the Northeast and North Central.
Perfect. And good comment. Bittersweet seeds go everywhere, so no wreaths. Exactly. How invasive is Chinese wisteria? And so, and I would love if people have other experiences with that. What I have found is that it's more problematic on the site where it sprouts up from its own roots. I haven't seen it just popping up everywhere from the seeds, but that might be just my experience in Northwest Ohio. And so if you've had a different experience, I would love to hear that. Spotted lanternfly. So yes, it is attracted to Atlantis. Its primary host, its favorite host. There have been some work to use that more as a monitoring tool. So if you're putting traps up or sticky bands or things like that, to put it on Atlantis or Tree of Heaven, because more than likely the insects, if they're in the area, will be on that tree rather than something else. So that could be part of the monitoring. In fact, I know master gardeners in Lake County and some other counties have adopted their own Atlantis in public areas, and they revisit that tree on a regular basis looking for signs and symptoms for spotted lanternfly. Let's see, lesser celandine. Yes. Oh, I should have probably included that one. That is becoming really problematic, almost a carpet in the spring with the yellow flowers, buttercup flowers. And it unfortunately is so beautiful, but it does take over areas. We're just starting to see it pop up in areas in Northwest Ohio. And unfortunately, I see pictures of kind of what our future will look like with these huge carpets. But again, very problematic. And so you have to be concerned whenever you're in those areas, managing those areas, that you're not, tracking them, taking them to other places. Japanese knotweed, yes, that can be problematic. And again, when we think about managing, think of multi-facet approaches. And so if it's spreading by seed, which is one of the avenues, what can we do to reduce the seed population until we can get a better handle on it? And so timing of, cutting back plants, and then also knowing that sometimes when we cut back certain plants, it actually is more problematic because the stored energy in the roots say, well, wait a second, we've got to grow more plants. Randy Heigelman he's retired from OSU, once said, if you have an Atlantis or a Tree of Heaven and you just cut it down with no other control opportunities or options, hundreds of its relatives are going to come to its funeral. So instead of having that one tree, all that stored energy in the root system will shoot up new plants. And I found this, it was just like a light bulb moment. There was an Atlantis that the power company had cut down underneath the power lines. No chemical treatment, just the cutting it back. The next 2 years, the whole block was actually Atlantis kind of shrubs or seedlings coming up from the roots. So instead of having just one problematic tree, now they had a whole block because they just kept suckering up and up.
Amy, anything striking about the room that you were in? Any questions or questions from the chat from before that you'd like to respond to?
Yeah, so English ivy came up from a couple people. And I don't want to say it's the good thing about English ivy, but I mean, it tends to, reproduce and become problematic in a certain area. So it's not like it's going to pop up, everywhere that people are going to have to deal with it. But if you have a situation, it can be very frustrating. So, staying on top of it, trying to do that removal, but know that when you're pulling those plants out, roguing them out, if there's any roots that are left, you're going to have, new plants. So being, on top of it and know that it's going to be a commitment over a period of time to try to do that. And then I think it was also interesting. So neighbors have certain plants, right, that are invasives, that are problematic, and people do everything they can on their own property to manage it. But when you've got a neighbor that has that source, it's a reoccurring problem. And so potentially sharing those landscape alternatives, might be something, to help with that situation.
I have a question. I've heard that with English ivy and winter creeper, that if you cut it when it starts to be going vertical rather than across the ground, that at least the winter creeper doesn't bloom until it starts going vertical. And so you need to cut that first. Is that true? I don't know.
Yeah, so especially at least my experience with the English ivy, trying to stay on top of it because it does have to reach age of maturity before it flowers and starts to set seed. And so by staying on top of it, continually cutting it back, you're at least avoiding it going to seed and reducing the spread of the plant that way. So you're exactly right. Staying on top of it, cutting it back, and then, looking at herbicide alternatives if you're open to that. Again, when the populations are really small and relatively, very, I guess, very small, that you can make those small applications rather than having a large plant that you're trying to deal with.
See, I have a question. I noticed you didn't mention multiflora rose, but I think that's, at least in our yard, that was a big problem. And we controlled it by cutting it back severely, saying, okay, that's it. And it came back. So we cut it back severely and then painted the stubs with undiluted Roundup. Could you comment on various control procedures, and especially that one?
Absolutely. And so some of those fact sheets that I shared will kind of take you through an IPM approach, which is really important, right? So what can I do with my hands? Are there other equipment that's needed? And then finally, are there products that might be helpful? And then you as a homeowner can choose, what process is going to work best for you. If you choose to use herbicides, and there are a lot of different herbicides that are on the market, just make sure that you're reading that label and understanding that properly and making the application properly. You're doing it in the correct window, right? And so sometimes we can make applications outside of the window, maybe temperatures are too low or the plant isn't actively growing. It's not going to be as effective. And so that label becomes and is the law. And so knowing that, and knowing that there are differences, right? And sometimes, it's better to use a surfactant or something, a sticker spreader that then makes that application apply to the leaves and kind of hold on a little bit more. So some of those thick glossy leaves, sometimes herbicides may just run off. And so an addition to the product may be useful and most beneficial. And so information from extension, research-based, which product works the best, the timing of that application is in those fact sheets that I'll share with you.
Great, thanks, Amy. So folks, let's do another quick breakout. I'm going to press the recreate button. So hopefully you'll get back into the group that you were in before. And this time what I'd like you to do is pick one of these plants, butterfly bush, myrtle, or calorie pear, and share your thoughts on some alternatives. Okay, so there's a lot of good gardening knowledge and plant knowledge in the room, the wider Zoom room. So we're going to think about the butterfly bush, myrtle, and calorie pear. What are some thoughts on alternatives? Okay, and so again, 6 minutes, we'll come back together, wrap up with a few more questions for Amy. So off you go. At least to the best of my knowledge, oh, there we go. Looks like you're going. Yeah. Hey, Troy, we are in breakout rooms. Let me see. Usually it lets me add people who are not in a room to a room. Hey, Troy, I can see you. I could see your mouth moving, but I couldn't hear you. But folks are in breakout rooms. We just have another minute or so. So hang tight.
Can you hear me now, Denise?
I can.
Okay. the kids got me a very big monitor to do work on, and apparently the way it hooks up disables the microphone, and even though it looks like it's working, it's actually not. Because every breakout room I've been in, nobody can hear me, and
I can't speak. Bummer. I can hear you now.
yeah, I disconnected that big monitor.
Okay, hang on. I'm give them a message. They've got a minute left. All right, now I'm going to close the room. So 60 seconds, they'll be back. Troy, I'm just going to mute you so we don't forget that. Just about a 30-second, in 30 seconds, those rooms will close, everyone. So if you hopped out early, we'll just have a couple seconds. But if you'd like, if you're back, if you'd like to put into the chat box some of your alternatives, so maybe include the invasive plant and the alternatives. So Vicky typed in Tiarella, so maybe put myrtle and then replace with Tiarella, just so we have a record of that in the chat, which plant you're offering a replacement for.
Denise, I have a question. Is there a specific website that will detail each invasive with photos of the different stages of the invasive? Because whenever I go to something to look up, okay, is that indeed what I'm looking at? It only shows like the flower.
Okay, hang tight, Carrie. And when everybody's back, I'll ask Amy. Let's see, I think Amy's back in. Yeah, Amy is back in the room. So Amy, once everyone's back in, Amy, Carrie had a question about a website that shows different stages of the invasives. Folks, as you're coming back in from your breakout room, if you want to put your suggestion for alternatives in the chat box, put the plant you're trying to replace as well as the plant you're offering as a suggestion. Okay, so we'll have that record in the chat box. Oh, looks like everybody's back. Okay, and then Amy, Carrie had a question about the stages of invasives, how to find some ID. And then also, Amy, just back to you, a couple questions or comments as we reach the end of our hour.
Awesome. So that's a really good question. In fact, we've talked about having some additional resources. There are a couple states that have some information, and so let me get those links to Denise, because it is important that has, the seedling stage and that immature stage, because that's often right when we want to control or manage it and not wait until it's flowering and has, seeds. So let me get that information to you. Looks like there's lots of great plant selections or suggestions coming in. Denise, do you see any of the questions? My chat's going so fast, I don't want to miss anything.
There was a question about, and I can't remember which oak it was now. Someone said they saw on one of your slides, you mentioned an oak, and they were worried that might be an invasive oak. I'm trying to find that.
It was me. It was sawtooth.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as I had mentioned, in that Great Lakes Early Detection app, it is multiple states. And so one of the states in the group has expressed interest or concern about that. And so we've opted to leave all those plants in because those are really kind of that watch list. So although I haven't personally seen it, it doesn't mean that it's not, and it's one that we want to keep an eye on.
Well, I wanted to ask a question because we've participated a couple of times in the tri-state woodlands conferences because we have acreage, and they gave us a sawtooth oak one year in the bare root trees they gave out. So is that, I don't know. I mean, I don't like to plant something that's problematic, but.
Right. And it's really a good point, right? So often, if you think of like soil and water conservation seedling sales, that, plants were sold for benefits of wildlife or other reasons. And then, 10, 20, 30 years, we're like, oh my gosh, these are problematic. And so I would have to look more, and I would refer to Kathy Smith about that oak question. But it's a learning process, right? Or a curve. And so we just have to be very cautious of plants that we're bringing into an area that haven't been there before, because how is it going to react in that new environment?